earlier and he said he found it. I'm just going to make sure he's coming. He said he'd get there early.
Oh, are we already live? That's very cool.
But we're not being heard, right?
Right now, we're still in practice mode. So you see at the top in there's an orange bar that says practice mode only. Attendees cannot join until you broadcast. So we're at 2:55. So I'm going to click broadcast now. Oh, it's going live on YouTube. Yes, sorry. But the actual webinar is officially live now. So I would cut down on any personal conversations.
Hello, everybody.
Hello, Bill. It's good to have you here. I'm glad you're able to join us.
The internet in Ripton, as usual, is a problem, but I think I've solved it for the moment.
Good. Well, I believe we are slightly live with our streaming, but not with not yet with the webinar. And I'm
Okay.
looking for one more student, but at the moment Tim and Alicia are here.
Hi, Tim. Hi, Alicia.
Bill McKibben. They'll be the first askers of questions.
Okay, good.
And Danielle Madison is with us.
Yes.
Danielle, thank you for arranging everything.
You're welcome. So we are officially live. People are able to join the webinar right now. We have 27 attendees at the moment. So at this point, we are 2 minutes from starting. So Tim and Alicia, they both have their cameras and microphones muted, which is wonderful. And then I'm going to mute mine. And Jim, in 2 minutes, when you're ready to start, you can go for it.
And then after I pass it on to Bill, I will turn off my camera.
Great, perfect.
Okay, and then I'll come back in after you're finished. Bill, how long do you think you'll be talking for?
I believe he said about 25 minutes earlier.
Okay. Are we having some trouble with the internet?
Sound about right? That's my plan. 20. If you were freezing up a minute ago. Okay. Or at least can you hear me?
Bill, can you hear me? Hello, everybody. We're having a little bit of technical difficulties. Just hold on for a few seconds. Thank you.
Hello, anybody?
Hello, Bill.
Hello.
We have you
Well,
now. We
All
can
right,
hear
I'm
you.
calling on the phone because the internet seems, as often happens, to have gone down, but I'm ready to go whenever you are.
All right, we'll start then.
Okay.
Good afternoon to Middlebury students in Vermont, in Monterey, and across the world, as well as to others who are viewing this webinar. My name is Jim Ralph, and I'm a member of the college's history department, as well as the Dean for Faculty Development and Research. but I'm serving as the host and moderator for this event on behalf of my faculty colleagues on the Post Commons Advising Committee. Earlier in the summer, the members of this committee began working on a series of initiatives to help with the welcoming back of students to a most unusual academic year. We knew that those students who were returning to campus would have a long period of quarantine, and that stage one of the phased reopening would last until September 15th. The committee wanted to make sure that there were a range of additional activities for all of you during this period. And this event represents the culmination of their efforts. The committee was fortunate that Bill McKibben, a distinguished scholar at Middlebury College, offered to speak to Middlebury students upon their return, and we quickly took him up on his offer. Bill will be speaking on a timely topic: this crisis and the next one, what the pandemic suggests about the century to come. There are few individuals better positioned to address this theme than Bill. Among many accomplishments, he is the founder of 350.org, a climate change organization with deep Middlebury roots. He is also the author of the classic The End of Nature, a study of our planet's looming environmental catastrophe, and more recently of Falter, Has the Human Game Begun to Play Itself Out? This summer, he wrote for the New Yorker magazine the much commented upon article, What Vermont and its History Might Teach the Nation About Handling the Coronavirus. Our plan this afternoon is to hear from Bill and then hear questions from students who are part of our panel before opening up the discussion to questions and comments from all of you. We've had a little bit of technical difficulty. Bill is here, and we're going to do our best in the 21st century. And Bill, can I turn it over to you?
Absolutely, you can, Jim, and it's a real pleasure to get to join everyone. I'm sorry to be doing it via telephone instead of Zoom, but it's possible the picture will kick back on at some point. Doesn't make that much difference. I'm not that good looking anyway. I would like to be able to show you the picture out the window up here in Ripton, because I'm sure it's beautiful down on campus, but it's beautiful up here by Breadloaf too. And I know that some of you haven't gotten a chance yet to get up the mountain and visit, and I hope that as things play out over the next few weeks, you'll be able to. Look, this is obviously an incredibly weird and difficult year in all kinds of ways, and the pandemic has changed your experience of college in ways that no one has dealt with for decades, at least since the Second World War, in terms of just disruption of daily life. So everybody feels bad about that in one way. And in another way, it's an incredibly interesting time, given that we're about the job of learning here. All of us, faculty and students, trying to think always about what things mean and what we can learn from them. I think we can learn an immense amount from this. And just to give you a slight example of what I mean before I sort of really dig into my topic, the pandemic has operated as a kind of X-ray of our world, our society, so that we can see things more clearly. So, for instance, the single most obvious thing that you can pick up from what's happened over the last 6 months is that Black and brown Americans are far more vulnerable than others to the COVID crisis. It's like a dye marker in the bloodstream for systemic racism, bad housing, bad medical care, neglect from government, and so on. And that's is true here in Vermont as it is any place else in the world. One of our few bad outbreaks was in Winooski, Vermont, which is probably has more new Americans, recent arrivals here than any other part of the state, and it also has the most dense housing stock, the most overcrowded homes that we have. So in the biggest sense, let's back up and say this crisis that we're living through now about the pandemic predicts other crises. If there was a single powerful quote from the last 6 months. It came tragically from George Floyd. And as you all know, what he said was, I can't breathe. Now, people can't breathe for all kinds of reasons, because a cop is kneeling on their neck because their community is stifled by police brutality. And it's usually the same people, can't breathe because there's a coal-fired power plant down the road. African Americans have 3 times the asthma rate of white Americans. Or they can't breathe, and this is today's news, they can't breathe because the wildfire smoke that fills the air is just too overwhelming. The air quality today on the west coast of the United States, where many of you are from, is worse than the air quality in New Delhi, the air quality in Beijing, the air quality any place on earth. It is not safe to be outside today in much of the United States. And I'm seeing if maybe my computer's working a little better now. The air quality is so terrible that people can't breathe safely. People can't breathe often because now it just gets too damn hot for normal life. In the weeks before the monsoon finally came to India this year, I was talking a lot with my friends in New Delhi. The temperature was routinely 118, 119, 120 degrees. And this in place where people don't mostly have air conditioning and where people are having to stay inside because of the pandemic. So we have this huge mix of crises on top of each other. As you can tell by those examples, what I'm most interested in, I think myself, is what this has to say about the climate crisis, which is my real work. I've spent the last 30 years working on what we now call global warming or the climate crisis, what we called the greenhouse effect when I began. I wrote the first book about it when I was 27 or 28 and went on with students at Middlebury to organize 350.org, which was the first iteration of a global grassroots climate movement. But this moment is really important for what it teaches us about these larger crises. If one was looking at the pandemic and trying to figure out what it meant about the climate crisis, here are the things I would say. First of all, it reminds us that reality is real. That sounds trite, but physical reality is easy for us to forget a lot of the time because, we live lives that are pretty removed from it, pretty abstracted, staring into screens. I've spent the last 30 years trying to remind people that chemistry and physics won't negotiate or compromise. And the pandemic was a good reminder that the same is true for biology. You can't tell them, it's fine for the president to get up and say it's all a hoax and whatever, but the microbe could care less. If it says stand 6 feet apart, then stand 6 feet apart. The second thing, and it's a kind of corollary to that, a property of that physical reality, is that speed in reacting to things really matters. We've learned a lot about flattening curves this year. The U.S. and South Korea had their first cases of COVID on the same day in January. South Korea went admirably to work, and it's not over there, but it's definitely in the rearview mirror, and with a tiny fraction of the suffering and the loss of life that we've experienced here. That's because we wasted a couple of months, as Bob Woodward has demonstrated over the last couple of days, despite the fact that the White House knew very well what was going on. That slow reaction is the equivalent to the way that we've done nothing about climate change over 30 years that the scientists have given us a warning. And so now, of course, we need to move with extraordinary speed. And truthfully, at Middlebury, you're in a very good place to learn about that and, more importantly, to work on that. There's some remarkable faculty who are really deep into these questions around climate change, and there are ample opportunities, official and unofficial, to take part in the fight. And I know that my friend Minna Brown, now working at Hillcrest, has doing really interesting work on mobilizing students around this sort of question of climate capacity. The third thing, though, that we learned, I think, from the pandemic, and it's probably the most important, is around this question of social solidarity. And it seems to me that what we're being taught is just how important that social solidarity is. I grew up in the political shadow of Ronald Reagan. He was the dominant figure in my early life, elected while I was in college, and brought with him, unlike most presidents, he really did realign the country around a new ideological idea. And that idea basically was that markets were going to solve all problems, that government was, as he put it, the problem, not the solution. Indeed, the most famous laugh line in Reagan's speeches always was, the 9 scariest words in the English language are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. Well, it turns out that the scariest words in the English language are, we've run out of ventilators, or the hillside behind your house is on fire and you have to leave now without any of your possessions. And those are not things that are solved by markets. Those are things solved by social solidarity of one kind or another, of governments learning to work competently, of people joining together with some trust in those governments and with each other. Which brings me back to Vermont for a minute. And I want to be very clear in talking about Vermont, where y'all are now, that it is in no way a paradise or a place without real problems. Among other things, it's painfully homogeneous, painfully white. But it is an interesting place, and one I hope that you really get to spend some time looking at and thinking about this year. Because American passports are now useless, I don't imagine too many of you are going to get to study abroad this year. But there's a sense then that you might want to make this place that you've wandered into a little bit of your field of study. So let's talk about Vermont. What's interesting about it, because of the pandemic, is that it has by far the lowest rate of COVID infection of any state in the country. Yes, it's a small state, the second smallest state in the union, but its rate of infection is extraordinarily low, on a par with what's going on in the best parts of Europe or Asia. And so the question is, why is that? What things have allowed it to happen? Again, it's not been perfect. There were a number of deaths very early on when there were outbreaks in 2 nursing homes in the Burlington area, and then there was that outbreak in Winooski. But statistically, the prevalence of the virus is very low here, which truthfully is the reason that you all are back at school, unlike your colleagues in many other parts of the country. So Vermont entered with some advantages. Its people are healthy by most standards, in part because there's been some commitment to government health care for poor populations for a long time, and Bernie Sanders has had a lot to do with that. And it's also a highly educated population. On the other hand, it has some disadvantages. It's poorer than the national average, and it's the second oldest state in the union. So given the fact that older people are particularly vulnerable to COVID, one would have expected probably to see fairly high levels I think that the answer to why Vermont's done better may, because no one's really studied it yet, we don't have great data, but my guess would be that it has something to do with the fact that Vermont has much higher levels of social trust than the rest of the country. And social trust is one of these concepts that you're going to spend some time on if you end up in sociology or political science or behavioral economics or a number of other fields. It's an important, these questions around social capital and social trust and things are interesting to study. And you can see them very close up in Vermont because its levels of social trust are anomalously high. The latest data shows that about 38% of Americans mostly or completely trust their neighbors. That's for America as a whole. But in Vermont, about 78% of residents think that people in my neighborhood trust each other to be good neighbors. 69% of Vermonters said they knew most of their neighbors, compared with 26% of Americans in general. So these are not small differences. These are double and triple the national average. And why does that matter? Why does that help as you're facing the kind of problems that we face? Well, it helps because it's easier for you to get widespread agreement on action that people should take. You know that most of the country has been seeing these marked clashes between people who do and don't want to open the economy or wear masks or whatever. And that's not been the case in Vermont. There was one rally called for people who wanted to open up the Vermont economy back in the spring. At the same time that, say, in Michigan, there were armed people outside the state legislature and the president was demanding that states be liberated from their governors and so on and so forth. In Vermont, there was a demonstration called for Montpelier outside the state capitol, and when the day came, there were 7 protesters on hand for that demonstration, and that was a pretty good reminder of the ways in which Vermont's different. It's not, and I want to stress this, it's not because Vermont is more liberal than other places, I don't think. Vermont does have a liberal political streak in that it elects Bernie Sanders by large margins as its senator. On the other hand, if I told you that the state of Vermont's governor was a Republican elected by a wide margin, who's best known for his earlier career as a stock car racer, in fact, he continues to be a stock car racer, you might be surprised. So it's not necessarily a kind of measure of liberal politics. It's a measure instead of this kind of cohesiveness. And we saw it in play very early on in Vermont because levels of people wearing masks voluntarily were extremely high. It wasn't until the 1st of August and really at the prospect of people arriving for college at UVM and Middlebury and elsewhere that the state finally adopted a formal mask mandate. But one of the reasons that they waited so long to do it was it wasn't that necessary in that people were already wearing masks in very large numbers. The interesting question is, what has happened to social trust in America, and why has it happened less in Vermont? What's happened to social trust in America is that it has declined very rapidly over the last few decades. Americans are much less trusting of their neighbors. They're much less likely to know their neighbors. They're much less likely to take part in civic organizations. And there's an endless collection of reasons for that. And what what academics would call an overdetermined answer, because there are so many possible answers, and all of them true to one extent or another, and they range from, spending time behind screens to the rise of polarization in our political system to on and on and on. All those things are true in Vermont, though to a lesser extent. Vermont is interesting in part because it's either the first or second most rural state in the Union. Now, that will surprise some of you to hear, because when we think about rural states, we think about the American West with their vast expanses of open land, which we don't have in Vermont by and large. But those western states tend to be oriented around one or two cities where most of the population lives. Vermont only has one city that's even remotely worth the name. Burlington is a city of about 50,000 people in a metropolitan area of about 150,000. Most of Vermont's population is spread through villages that are scattered across the state. It is a state of villages, and what that means is that people tend to know each other better. More to the point, what it means is that it's enabled this long Vermont tradition of very close democratic self-governance. Vermonters have governed their communities in a way unlike almost all the rest of the country. Parts of New Hampshire and Massachusetts are the same, but we govern ourselves with town meeting. So on the first Tuesday in March each year in each of the towns of Vermont, everybody gets together in the school cafeteria, in the church, wherever it is, and they have what's called town meeting. And at town meeting, people vote on the town budget for the next year, and they take up all the other business of the town. And everybody can come, and a lot of people do come. And you're welcome to go watch the one in Middlebury, or indeed any of the ones in the surrounding communities. And if you register to vote in Vermont, you're welcome to go take part in the one in Middlebury in March. And I'd recommend at least going to see it, because it's a very interesting thing. And one of the things I think it means is that people have to be somewhat more, somewhat less polarized than they are in the rest of the country, simply because you have to get the business of the town done and everyone knows it. I wrote in that New Yorker piece that if someone like Donald Trump showed up at our town meeting and started spouting on all his usual stuff, people would listen for a couple of minutes and then just tell him that his turn was over and it was time to sit down, because we had to figure out, whether there was another year left in the roof over the school or whatever it was. And you can see this same kind of political pragmatism up and down the state. So the governor that I told you about is a Republican, but in fact he's quite moderate Republican, and refused to endorse Trump for election on the grounds that he was behaving badly. So I'm running on a little bit here, and I want to stop so that we have time for questions. But the point that I'm trying to make is that as we figure out as societies how to go forward dealing with the climate crisis that is overwhelming us or close to it, the pictures today from out west are extremely sad and depressing. As we do that, we need to be thinking, among other things, about these questions around social capital and social trust. It's very difficult to figure out how to handle crises like the pandemic or the larger crisis of climate change without paying attention to these social dimensions of them. That's why, for instance, the Green New Deal is so interesting. It attempts not only to take on the kind of technological parts of the climate problem, but to expand beyond them to deal with the social dimensions of those problems as well. And that's, I think, going to prove to be really important. whether we can build the necessary social trust in order to make those changes, not just within this country, but among the countries of the planet, and whether we can do it in the very short time that physics still allots us, is an open question, but it's the most interesting, I think, open question that the society faces. And so all I'm arguing is you might be in a fairly good place to look at and think about it. Don't let Vermont solely be a scenic backdrop for your education. Engage with it some while you're here, and you may find it to be an extremely interesting intellectual place as well. And there I end.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you very much. And now we're going to turn to some student panelists that we have here at the webinar to ask the first questions, and then we'll turn to questions from all of you. But with us this afternoon are three students, Tim Hua and Alicia Panay, who are both of whom are Febs last spring when the COVID disruption struck, and Daisy Lizgren, who has joined Middlebury this fall. And say they will ask the first questions. I'll ask one of them to step forward.
Hi, so I'm Tim. I guess I can go first. Can everybody hear me? Is it? Yeah. So I'd like, thank you for your talk, Mr. McKibben. And I was thinking about when you said that the pandemic acts as an X-ray on and exposes society's problems and the importance of social trust, in how Vermont has succeeded in combating the virus. And my question is, I feel like although maybe through this process in Vermont, there's been like an increase of social trust. Everybody can see that, their neighbors are wearing their masks and they're acting responsibly. Do you think that this has, however, decreased social trust in perhaps other parts of the nation, where some people are seeing the anti-mask protests and, in other words, like even though it has acted an X-ray on society's problems, has it also possibly made them worse instead of better?
That's a really good question, Tim. And truthfully, I think we'll find out some of the answer on November 3rd. I think we'll see whether Americans are recoiling from the polarization that's marked the last 4 years and especially the last 6 months, or whether they're just completely still going to be engaged in it. It's been one of the most painful parts of all of this. I mean, this pandemic is hard enough if you've got everybody pulling in the same direction and doing the same thing, but it's extremely difficult when it is overlaid on a kind of deep divisions within society. So I do think probably that there are parts of the country where it's exacerbated these tensions, but my provisional guess, and as I say, we'll have a better sense on November 3rd, my provisional guess is that actually a fair number of Americans have been scared by the level of polarization around this and want it reduced. I think the polling data so far shows that most people really do understand that it would be a good idea to be looking out for each other. And so we'll see how that goes over time. But it's clearly been, along with an X-ray, a kind of slap upside the head to Americans. And I think we don't yet quite know what that means.
Alicia or Daisy?
I can go now. So in your New Yorker article, you mentioned that Vermont's motto is freedom and unity, and that unity is really playing a big part in our response to, especially Vermont's response to COVID. How do you see those two themes and ideas playing out in the national response to climate change, especially?
Well, I think that it's a very, very good question. And if you go look, you're absolutely correct, Alicia. If you go look at the Vermont state flag, it says freedom and unity across the bottom. Vermont's history is extremely interesting, by the way, just for anybody who wants to take a look at it. Though Vermonters fought in the Revolution, and you'll learn all about Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys, if you want, Vermont was not one of the original 13 states that joined the Union. It was its own independent republic for a while, and that was its motto. We have chosen, I think, unity above utter freedom here in Vermont during the course of the pandemic. Not consciously, that wasn't the terms that people were talking about it in, but that's the kind of template that it fell into. And I think in much of the rest of the country, in too many places, this idea of freedom has been, freedom without responsibility has been kind of exalted. And hence people loudly upholding their right to do whatever it is, often to walk into a store without wearing a mask. An odd freedom if you think about it, since every store in the country has a sign in the window that says no shirt, no shoes, no service. It's a little hard to figure out why, why shoes don't aggravate people, but masks do. But at any rate, that notion, and I think a fairly juvenile notion of freedom, the kind of don't tell me what to do reaction has been strong. But as I was trying to say in answer to Tim's question, the interesting question will be, having seen this, how will Americans react? Will they say, we want this, we just want to keep having this fight forever? Or will they say, as I think the Biden campaign's kind of subliminal messaging is centering around, do we want to calm things down? Do we want to see if we can return in certain ways to an older America that perhaps was less centered on individual freedom? This is a larger discussion to be had, but my writing in my last book were really centered around the idea, and I talked a little bit about this when I was talking about Ronald Reagan, centered around the idea that the key change in America over the last few generations has been this rise of a kind of hyper-individualism, a kind of libertarian response to things. And one of the results of that has been the acceptance of incredibly high levels of economic inequality that we see across our society now, far higher than when I was your age. And I think that there, too, that acceptance of that kind of just freedom of people to do whatever they want, never mind what it meant for other people, is probably starting to be called into question now in a way that it hasn't before. So I think these are deep, powerful questions at the very heart of the American political experiment in the 21st century. And I got to say, have the kind of feeling that this may be our last chance to get them right, that if we don't get them right very quickly, that some of these crises that we're facing are going to really overwhelm our ability to respond to them.
Thank you, Alicia and Bill. And Daisy, do you have a question?
I do, yeah. Thank you so much for your lecture. It was really nice to hear. So I also have somewhat of a bigger question like the other two. So maybe you'll be able to answer this better than I guess some other people would, but do you think that the economic repercussions, specifically in Vermont, will be worse than the virus itself because it's so dependent on its economy is so dependent on tourism, and how do you think that will affect social trust?
Well, that's a really good question, Daisy, and a fascinating one. Vermont could have reacted very differently to this because, as you point out, it's a heavily tourist-dependent state, and the shutdown has been very painful for all kinds of businesses. And interestingly, at least so far, that doesn't seem to have shaken people's commitment to looking out for each other, you know. it's what's made this discussion about y'all coming back to school so interesting for Vermonters. There were a lot of Vermonters, I think, who didn't want people coming back to college this fall, or at least were of two minds about it. Because look, on the one hand, everybody loves having young people around and new faces in the community and all of that. And of course, communities like Middlebury are very economically dependent on the university, on the college. On the other hand, everybody's scared, that having done this pretty good job ourselves, we'd be opening ourselves up to people coming in from a distance. And it's why, so far, everybody's super pumped that that students have done a really good job over the first couple of weeks, and why everybody's really hopeful that the same kind of levels of social trust that prevail in Vermont will prevail on campus and in the kind of relationship between campus and community, i.e. that people will take it seriously and not go, have dumb parties or whatever it is. I think that Vermonters may really have gotten their reward for being good citizens in a lot of ways when public schools reopened last week, not seamlessly, but not. It's going better than it is most places, and kids are getting to play sports and all those kind of things. And I think that they're looking forward to congratulating everybody in the college communities too, if things continue to go the way that they're going. So many, many thanks to you all so far for being extremely responsible, and one hopes very much that it continues.
Well, these are terrific opening questions, and we will continue. And now I'm going to invite all of you who have been listening to use the Q&A function and send a question, and I'll relay it to Bill, and we'll have a discussion that way. A question has already come in, Bill, and the question is, does the politicization of such a blatant public health crisis, such as COVID-19, destroy any hope that the climate crisis will ever become an apolitical issue?
Well, that's a good question, Otto. I don't think, I'm afraid that it's been a long time since there was much hope that the climate crisis would be an apolitical issue. It should have been. It's a straight up scientific question, and it has been from the beginning. But because so much money and interest, vested interest was at stake, it didn't stay a straight up scientific question for long. The fossil fuel industry, which 10 or 20 years ago was the most powerful industry in our country, decided, we now know from great investigative reporting, to make it an issue, to try and get people to doubt the science, even though they knew that science was correct. And hence began this long politicization of this issue that's, gone from the point where in 1988, then Republican President George H.W. Bush, Bush the Elder, promised, as he put it, to fight the greenhouse effect with the White House effect, which was a pretty good line, to our current dispensation, where the current Republican president declares somehow that climate change is a hoax invented by the Chinese, and he is cheered on in this delusion by large parts of his party. The reason for that, I think, is not that most of them are unaware of the actual physics of the situation. It's that the fossil fuel industry has, in many ways, purchased one of our political parties. The Koch brothers, our biggest oil and gas barons, became the single biggest donors in American political history, and by a very large margin. And that's been enough to polarize this powerfully. So maybe a different way of thinking about the question, Otto, is whether there's a possibility of depoliticizing it. And I think maybe, and I think the reason is because the extraordinary scenes that we're now witnessing around the country of environmental devastation, most of all the wildfires that we see now. If you look at the New York Times today, the banner headline says, West ablaze, climate events force millions from their homes, or something like that. Those things may be reaching a point where it's impossible for any politician who's interested in keeping their job to avoid taking on this issue. Now, whether they'll do anything useful about it, and mostly whether they'll do anything about it quickly enough to matter, is a different question. But if one hoped for a depoliticization, it would be some combination of that stark evidence from Mother Nature and the great work that people have done to weaken the power of the fossil fuel industry, including, thank you, those people at places like Middlebury who managed to get their institutions to divest from fossil fuel. That's turned out to be one of the things that's really sapped the political power of this industry over the last years.
We have a couple of other questions coming in. I'll go first with one that follows up. I think, both do follow up on what you were just talking about. What I'll lead with this. This question is framed the following. Could you talk a little bit about how people are saying that COVID has helped the climate crisis? Certainly for a while, people were driving less, but now it is going to make things worse as people are fearful of transmission on public transportation, et cetera. What are other?
That's a very good question. Very, very good question. So let's recall for a minute just how weird things were in the spring. I mean, we locked down our economy, our civilization, across most of the world. I don't know anybody who got on an airplane for months. People stopped commuting. These were enormous changes, far larger changes in daily habit than anyone thought possible, or that any environmentalist, believed was within the realm of possibility. So when that happened, one of the things that happened was that emissions of greenhouse gases fell. But they didn't fall really as much as one might have thought they would. We think now that they dropped somewhere on the order of 10% or so, which is not nothing. I mean, that definitely helps in a way. But that means that, as soon as we got back to doing much of what we normally do, those emissions have gone back up again. And as the questioner points out, the fact that people are going to drive instead of take public transportation out of pandemic fears may make that worse, not better. But more to the point, what it revealed was that about 90% of the problem wasn't having so much to do with individual habits, but instead was hardwired into our system. And I think it made it clear that we're going to need to reach inside that system and tear its guts out, take out the coal and gas and oil and put in a lot of sun and wind and insulation to have some chance of mathematically dealing with the crisis that we're in.
And I'll follow that up with a question, thanking you for your talk, and that you mentioned Vermont is an extremely white state, and Vermont residents have strong social trust. I was wondering if the ideological polarization in more diverse regions of the country cause you to lose hope that people of different backgrounds and ideology can come together on important issues such as climate change, fighting COVID, the election, et cetera.
One has to hope and believe that diversity produces strength, not weakness. I think it's Vermont's great weakness, its lack of diversity, and the thing about it that needs most to change. And I think that it's at least possible that the racial reckoning we're undergoing in the wake of George Floyd's brutal murder has some chance of readjusting some of that polarization. The early polling and things has been more hopeful than I would have thought. But I think the best news in a lot of ways, if you're dealing with the climate crisis anyway, is that America is steadily becoming a less white country. The two groups statistically that care by far the most about climate change when we do polling and survey research are Latinx Americans and African Americans. And their numbers are much, much higher in terms of concern about climate change. I think mostly because people live in conditions that make them much more exposed to the vagaries of a rapidly heating climate. These are always the iron law of climate change is the less you did to cause it, the less money you have, the harder and sooner you get hit. And that's been as true for climate change as it has for COVID or anything else. So I hold out some hope that demographic transition that's underway in this country is going to help us with a lot of these issues over time. But it would certainly help it a lot if at the same time there was some real grappling with America's past and some attempt at a serious reconciliation underway from white Americans.
And Olivia Summers asks about scaling up social trust. How can we translate event settings such as town meetings that facilitate and encourage trust to a bigger scale, be it more dense cities or on a nationwide level?
Well, that's a very good question. And, one of the things that's been, y'all are able to tell by this point that I'm not a particular fan of the incumbent occupant of the White House. One of the things that's been most destructive about the Trump presidency, I think, is the abandonment, really for the first time in American history, of even the rhetorical notion that we were a united people and that the president represented all of us and so on and so forth. The endless effort to divide us has been all too successful. So one of the things that will happen if he leaves is that at least that pressure will be reduced somewhat, and we'll be at a place where we're at least rhetorically beginning to try to imagine a working polity again. But you're right, Olivia, it's going to take a ton of work to make that happen. There are emerging interesting ideas about democratic forms that might help. For instance, emerging out of the climate world, especially in Europe, but now in parts of the United States, are these quite interesting experiments called citizens' assemblies, where hundreds of people are picked almost at random, as if from a phone book, and then brought together for a weekend or a week or something, and they spend a lot of time talking with experts and then draw plans that they recommend about what to do about problems like climate change. And these have proved to be highly interesting, and the plans that they produce highly rational because probably they're much less influenced by vested interest. So there may be possibilities with things like that. A deep problem, I think, at this point, is that our media ecosystem is such that it almost automatically divides us. That is, if you start in on Facebook or YouTube or whatever, looking at one thing, it just feeds you more of that same thing over and over and over again. One of the things I noted in that New Yorker article that was kind of interesting was that Vermont's two statewide kind of key news sources, 7 Days and a website called Vermont Digger, decided in the course of the pandemic to discontinue having a comments section where people could react to articles and things, partly because they wanted to stop the spread of bad information, scientific information, and partly because I think they've become kind of forums for soreheads, and there's something interesting about that approach to trying to deal with this. It's obviously problematic in certain ways too, because you want free, open exchange of ideas at all times. As I say, Vermont specializes in that at town meeting, but it's very much within limits. If you're an idiot, people don't pay attention to you.
We have a couple of questions, and I'm looking at the time, and I'm going to combine these. And I saw that some questions went in the chat as well. And I think we'll end with these 4 questions, and I'll bring 2 of them together. Two of them in the Q&A deal with political parties. The first is about the Green Party, and whether you support the Green Party, and then also is Joe Biden claim that he'll return to the United States to the Paris Climate Accords. Do you think this promise will be enough? And then connected with that is more broadly that many people have felt let down by Biden's nomination. And do you think that he enshrines the values required to really bring people together, especially in a time of high racial tensions, climate emergency, and societal inequality? And that's from Lynn Tronakova. So,
all right, these are very good questions, and I'll put on my activist hat a little bit as I answer them. Cards on the table. I'm a Bernie guy. When Bernie announced he was running for president in 2016, the 3 people who introduced him that day were me and Ben and Jerry. Okay, so that's my basic politics. It means that Biden was not my first choice for president, probably not my second or third choice either. That said, I've been very impressed watching, especially on climate, as he and his team have reached out and taken a lot of input from a lot of places. In particular, I think most importantly from the Sunrise Movement, these are people who are friends of mine because most of them cut their teeth on campus divestment movements over the last 5 or 6 years. Varshini Prakash, who is their wonderful leader, was the person who divested UMass Amherst, and I was deeply involved in all these divestment campaigns. And when they got out of college, they formed the Sunrise Movement in order to keep working on these issues, and now they've become, I think, the most significant political players in the environmental movement. And Varshini and AOC joined together in a 6-person task force with several representatives from the Biden campaign to hammer out climate policy. It's not perfect, but it's way more progressive than we've ever seen any American political party propose. So that brings you to the question of, does one support the Green Party instead, because it's purer. I actually do a lot of work with Green parties in Australia, in Europe, in Canada, helping them in all the ways I can and cooperating and working with them, because those are parliamentary systems where third parties have some structural ability to play a really important role, and in some of them they have. We don't have a parliamentary system. We have a 2-party system that really has been that way rigidly for a long time. And therefore, in our system, a vote for the Green Party is not useful. I mean, last time around, the Green Party took enough votes that it might have been, certainly was one of the differences in a very, very tight election. And that said, I've been spending some time this year working on something that I hope those of you who are studying political science will take a hard look at, because I think it's a really interesting answer to this perplexing question of how, without a constitutional amendment that we're unlikely to get, you change some of that 2-party structure. Google something called ranked choice voting, which has now been adopted in the state of Maine and may be adopted in the state of Massachusetts in the election this year, and it is extremely interesting because it lets you, instead of voting for one candidate in an election, it gives you a ballot with, say, 10 names on it running for, say, president. And you would get to rank them 1 to 10. And so you could vote for the Green Party candidate first because that fully represented everything you believed about the world. And then you'd vote for Joe Biden second if you were a liberal. And that would keep your vote from being wasted because they would go through, and if the Green Party guy only got 2 or 3% of the vote, they'd eliminate him or her from the race and redistribute their votes to whoever you voted for second on your list. This ranked choice voting system used in many other parts of the world is an effective way, I think, to begin to make it much more possible for those third-party elements to show themselves. But for the moment, I think, as Bernie and AOC and whatever, who many others have pointed out, the best choice for people in that political camp is, at the moment, to stick with the Democratic Party and elect someone like Biden and then go to work pressuring him. I worked very hard to elect Barack Obama president in 2008, and then helped organize what became the largest demonstrations outside the Obama White House, I think, during his presidency, in order to get him to reject the Keystone Pipeline, which he did. So it's possible to think of politics on a kind of on a more complicated scale than we sometimes do.
And Bill, I've gone to the chat and I noticed a couple questions, and yeah, one of them had come in earlier, and it might be one. I know it's one that you've already addressed, and it was while you were talking. You mentioned that, and this is from Kat Fink, that Vermont is painfully white and homogeneous. Do you think this distorts the higher percentages of social trust seen throughout Vermont in comparison to national averages?
I don't know if there's good data on that. I doubt that that's the determining factor, but I don't know. My guess is it has more to do with its particular histories and its geographic and settlement patterns. But I don't think anyone's ever done sort of really powerful study on that. But it's definitely true that Vermont needs to undergo the experiment of becoming much more diverse and see how it handles it.
And here's our last question, and this is from William Robertson. In your opinion, what is the likelihood that the origins of COVID are related to climate change? In addition, how possible is it that we experience an increase in future pandemics due to climate change?
COVID itself probably is not directly linked to climate change. It's much more likely linked to the increasing destruction of habitats and ecosystems around the world. And so there's been an increasing amount of transmission from wild animal populations, these zoonotic diseases. So that said, it's very clear that disease in general, including many vector-borne diseases, are increasing dramatically as the climate warms. And we could talk about any number of them, dengue spreading across the developing world, whatever. Let me just leave you, since we're here in Vermont, with a warning about the climate-related disease that we're very increasingly prone to here. In fact, by some measures, Vermont may have more of it per capita than any place in the country, and that's Lyme disease, spread by ticks that are much more able to overwinter and reproduce as our winters become less intense. So be careful out there. Make sure you spend a lot of time in the woods and a lot of time in the fields and a lot of time on the TAM, the trail around Middlebury, whenever you're released to go onto it and whatever else. And please make sure you get up here to Ripton and spend a lot of time at Breadloaf, because it is the single biggest jewel in all of Middlebury's operations. But when you're done spending all that good time outdoors, make sure you check yourself for ticks carefully, because Lyme disease is no joke.
Thank you very much for those words and thoughts. And this brings us to the end of our program. I'd like to thank the many people who made it possible, and especially Danielle Madison with our media service technician, and as well our student questioners, Alicia, Daisy, and Tim, and all of you, of course, and finally, Bill McKibben. Thank you very, very much. I wish everybody a good afternoon and a good weekend. Take care.
Take care.